Hello, this is Rick Harnish. I'm the Executive Director of the High Speed Rail Alliance. Very happy to have you all join us today for what we view as a very important issue. At the Alliance, we are doing this work because we believe that communities will be stronger, families will be stronger, will have more financial and economic opportunities if we can shift people in large numbers from cars to walking, buses, and trains. And one of the biggest tools for making the biggest shift is high-speed rail. But we're working for the entire integrated picture that makes it possible for people to leave their cars at home. Intercity buses have a critical role to play in that. And so we're excited today to do a joint webinar with Better Streets Chicago to talk about what we believe is a critical issue nationally, because in so many ways Chicago is the hub of transportation. And if bus service to and from Chicago declines, that'll cause a cascading effect across the entire country as fewer people use the intercity bus network. So the future of having a indoor off-street bus terminal for the future in the city is really, for us, a very critical issue. So today we're going to have Joe Schwieterman, the director of the Chaddick Institute at DePaul, who's been a longtime friend of the Alliance. Gildan Bruton, who's the head of public affairs for FlixBus and Greyhound. And for those who are new to the issue, FlixBus bought Greyhound several years ago, so it's becoming more and more the same company. And then Alderman Carlos Ramirez Rosa, who represents the Logan Square neighborhood of Chicago. So we're very excited about the program. Quick agenda of how we're going to move forward. In this, if you have a question that we will ask at the end, please put that in the questions and answers. That's the primary place for questions. And then for any discussion you want to have amongst ourselves, that is in the chat. So we'll have questions at the end. Please put the questions in as you move forward. So setting the stage for me, and personally, how I think this should be resolved, in creating some context here. You know, there's an important airport that we're very happy exists in the center of the country, the Central Illinois Regional Airport. That is the airport for Bloomington and Normal. And it is important enough that they created a public authority to own that airport and manage it. And it happens to carry roughly the same number of people as the intercity bus terminal does today in Chicago. And you can see that it's a very large piece of land. And that public authority, because this is so important to that community, homeowners are supporting that authority with, if it's about $150,000 house, it's about $55 a year that a homeowner supports that airport. So on the right-hand side is the Chicago bus terminal. Those are to scale in terms of the cost or the size of the facility. And you can see that we're talking about a significantly smaller asset that needs to be supported. So we believe that there should be a public entity of some nature, and the Chicago should be very highly involved in making that happen in order to make it possible for bus companies of all kinds to come in and serve the city and provide a key place for people to transfer. So we'll get the program started with Joe Schwieterman of the Chaddick Institute, who'll give a brief overview of what the issue is, and then we'll move to Gilda with Flix and Greyhound. So Joe, take it away.
Yeah, thank you, Rick. Good introduction. And this really is a pressing issue. And we do think bus lines will probably have to move out before September 30th to the lease provisions. But to give you a sense of why this is so important, the station was built in 1989 It's Mid-America's connecting hub. And I have a route map up here showing the current state of routes into the terminal. And as you can see, it goes lots of places, the train doesn't go. There's a lot of synergy between the modes. There also is important to note that we in the United States have something really unique and really tremendous. It's called the National Interline Bus Network, where about 24 bus lines interconnect and you can buy a single ticket. So somebody you can see in Cleveland there going to Omaha can buy a through ticket on Greyhound and then connect to Trailways. And it's a tremendous resource critical to low income populations. And recent numbers show the majority of passengers have household incomes of less than 50,000. And if you take Chicago out of the mix and move to curbside loading, which is being talked about, those connections probably could no longer be sold. You simply can't drop somebody off at the street in January and say, wait here 3 hours in the snow. So Chicago, we did some analysis. There simply aren't other connecting points for people. You can't send people through St. Louis on so many routes that the loss of the station by limiting the amount of through traffic will by consequence result in pretty major service cuts because a lot of routes will no longer be viable. So suddenly we'll see Chicago has less service to all destinations because you take away that 30% of tow traffic that connects. Other things to point out is that, the climate controlled waiting room is really important. While you have point-to-point operations, say in the Northeast, where people can come at the last minute, that really doesn't work for the kind of trips here and with our weather. And so we are, quite concerned about the ripple effects of the loss of the station. There's been nothing quite like it in the United States in terms of consequence of taking something this basic out of the system. I'll go to the next slide, Rick.
Oh,
so to give you a sense of our station, it's built in 1989, has roughly 20 bus bays. It's right near the blue line. The location's actually gotten a lot better in the last 5 or 6 years because of the old post office opening, a lot of residential development that way, some South Loop and Union Station development. So what we see is that the station is pretty modern. It's built in 89, has indoor vending, a snack bar, clean restrooms, pretty good access. And we think the terminal can probably be purchased for around $20 to $30 million, which sounds like a lot, but it's extremely small amount when you do that. So the 4 companies that use it now, you see there. Also, we think there are 3 or 4 other bus lines that serve Chicago that would like to go in there if it became a public facility. Rick mentioned Indian Trails, a Peoria charter, leaves from a location under that expressway you see, a very desolate location. So there's a lot of possibilities for this becoming even a bigger station than it is today. And finally, before I turn over the microphone in a second, today, and I'll put this in the chat, is my Institute of the Paws releasing a policy brief showing that Chicago will become the largest city in the Northern Hemisphere in the world without an intercity bus station. And that's not a distinction that a town with considers itself a great transportation hub should certainly want to have. And we have looked around the world, and it's just standard for cities to have an intercity station. I think in the United States, this problem is partly occurring because we are kind of alone of having privately owned stations in which the entire burden of the facility is borne by bus lines. And the property tax on that station alone paid by Greyhound has topped $120,000 a year in the past. So public involvement in preserving the station, whether it's a lease extension, financial support for the station, options to bring it under public ownership with perhaps county and transportation agency involvement are really important. And so we're quite upset that there doesn't appear to be a technical analysis of our options as the looming deadline comes. There's been kind of minimalist approach, moving to a curb, find a spot for them so there's a place to pick up people. But there hasn't been any sort of scenario analysis done by City Hall, bringing the stakeholders together. And that's why we're on this crisis today. So I'll turn the podium over to our next speaker, but look for our brief. I'll put a link in the email showing, or in the chat showing why we're about to become the world's largest Northern Hemisphere city without a station.
And our next speaker is Gilda Bruton from FlixBus.
Thank you. Guys, I really appreciate the opportunity that you presented us, and I appreciate the platform that you've given us to again emphasize how important it is that we continue talks and have a plan in place, because time is running out. We are in a dire situation. Our lease expires soon, and is that on September 20th is our date that we should be out of the facility on the where we are currently. When we vacate that facility, short term, we are looking at Harrisburg Street, adjacent to Union Station. We currently have a location there that sells tickets. It has easy access, Jackson Boulevard, I'm sorry. It has easy access to the ticket counter as well as loading area. So that's an area that is short term, but as you all know, the fabric of this country is based on inner city transportation. And you just said it, the fourth largest city, and no, I'm sorry, you're the third largest city. Chicago, we are the third largest city in the country. We deserve a service, an intermodal service that would also accommodate customers that would use any mode of transportation. We've been working with the mayor's office, as you all know, city agencies and Illinois' DOT to find a solution in the loop. Again, the short term would be Amtrak, and then long-term solution would be an intermodal facility such as the one is in LA and in New York City. It would give our customers an ease of use, ease of transfers, ease of using other modes of transportation. And this is what, would be our goal, is to have a long term. And it would also be something that would hopefully grow throughout the country. We already have intermodal, as I said, and we're looking for that same possibility there in Chicago.
It's excellent. Thank you. And then Alderman, thank you for joining us. I know you missed the beginning, but we really appreciate you being here. Take it away.
Yes, I was actually here from the beginning, so I've heard all the speakers thus far. Well, it's really exciting to see over 100 people be part of this webinar today. I think it really shows the interest in this extremely important issue. And it's an issue that I, alongside some of my colleagues, have been working to raise for this administration to ensure that the city of Chicago is not falling behind when it comes to transportation planning. The Amtrak station, Union Station, is an option that has been discussed in the short term. However, in my conversations with Amtrak, they have made it very clear in no uncertain terms that they are not prepared to accept all of Greyhound, now Flix North America's passengers within Union Station. Union Station is owned and operated by Amtrak. If you've been by there during rush hour, you know just how packed it gets. Every single chair, every single table is full of people. The bathrooms are full. And Amtrak is set to begin a $1 billion plus renovation of their facility next year. That's in addition to the work that's already happening on Canal. So if you go by Greyhound Station right now, you will see all of the Uber and Lyft vehicles that are picking up and dropping off outside. You will see all of the vehicles idling as they drop off or wait to pick up a loved one. So you can just imagine what would happen if all of those vehicles were added to an already congested Jackson Boulevard. In addition to that, you would then have all of the additional passengers that would be inside of Union Station. And so, Flix North America and Amtrak have been in conversations, but ultimately it is up to the city of Chicago to permit where Flix North America will pick up and drop off in the short term as we work towards a permanent intercity bus terminal. So I have been pushing the city internally to really bring all stakeholders together, I was mentioned earlier, to ensure that we're figuring out what is the short-term solution that really meets the needs of the poor and working class people that rely on Greyhound for their transportation needs. So many of them are returning citizens, people that are returning from being incarcerated. Some of them are poor and working class people that have no other way to reach their loved ones in small and mid-sized towns and cities. And so we really want to make sure that their needs are being met and that it's being done in a way that really promotes transportation in the city of Chicago. Thanks to our advocacy efforts, we were able to get the city of Chicago to meet with Amtrak. That had not previously happened. It's actually happening right now while this webinar is taking place. So hopefully that meeting goes well. Amtrak has put together a presentation that sort of lays out why Union Station is not a good short-term solution. So we're hoping that we can figure out what are other alternative sites. There are metro stations like LaSalle Street. There's Oglesby Transportation Center. There are places in the Oglesby Transportation Center that have vacancies that could serve as a short-term lease option for Greyhound Flix North America. But long-term, we know that what is needed is an intercity bus terminal. As has been said repeatedly on this call, Chicago will be the largest city in North America without an intercity bus terminal. That is embarrassing. It is totally unacceptable. And so for that reason, myself and Alderman Daniel Espada filed a resolution in the Committee on Pedestrian and Traffic Safety. We're hoping that in September, this resolution will be heard by the committee, and it will be an opportunity for stakeholders to come together and talk about what are the long-term and short-term solutions. We know that the company that split off from Greyhound and is selling the station, they're looking to redevelop that site, and they're looking to maximize their profit in the sale of that site. I think it's up to the city to think creatively. How do we leverage zoning and land use and planning to have a community benefits agreement? I think that there is an opportunity to think through a mixed use development at that site. We could have a first floor intercity bus terminal with retail and commercial on that floor, and above that we could have housing there. So there is a way that you could leverage the city's zoning processes to result in a community benefits agreement that could result in an intercity bus terminal. There's also federal funding, and thus far we have not acquired federal funding, but I think that we need to be working seriously as a city and as a community of stakeholders to figure out how we can tap into federal funding to be able to accomplish a intercity bus terminal at the site that Greyhound currently occupies. I've also heard a rumor, and again, this is a rumor that has not been verified to me yet, but that there is a tunnel that connects the Clinton Blue Line station to Union Station. If that is the case, then let's look at that as another way to connect these various different transportation services. If we could find a way to connect the Blue Line with an intercity bus terminal with Amtrak and have that be underground, particularly on hot days like this or super cold and windy and snowy days, I think that would be a really great way to improve transit and connectivity, particularly for some of our most vulnerable users in the city of Chicago. So the resolution that we introduced asks the city to think creatively, to look at various different options of how we can accomplish an intercity bus terminal. And we want to hear in the committee from the city's planning and transportation staffers What exactly is the work that has been done? What are the plans in the short term and the long term? Ultimately, as a member of the Chicago City Council, I am looking to ensure that this administration is not falling behind and that we as a city are coming together to address this issue. So again, I hope to be able to have a hearing on that resolution in September, to be able to hear from Flix North America, to be able to hear from Amtrak, to be able to hear from the Department of Transportation, as well as officials in the mayor's office that have been leading up these conversations. I think it's an extremely important one, and I want to thank Better Streets Chicago and the High Speed Rail Alliance for taking the time to put together this webinar today.
Thank you very much. Thank you for coming. As sometimes too much of a stickler for detail, there should be a connection between the Blue Line and Union Station, but there isn't. And that's one of the things that's bugged us for many years. So I really appreciate, Alderman, you taking this on as as an important issue, and looking forward to helping get the proper input that you need at the hearing. I think, Mike, you had some comments as well.
Yeah, I did have a few final comments that I wanted to share. For everybody, I'm Michael Podgers. I'm the policy director at Better Street Chicago. Again, I just want to thank Rick for helping us co-host this event, and everybody for joining it, and of course Alderman Ramirez Rosa for getting that resolution through so we can actually have a discussion in a public forum about this issue. I just wanted to note, and I realize we lost the PowerPoint here, but one of the things that Better Street Chicago has been hearing about a lot from our constituents and our partners is actually some of the more, great, this is perfect, thank you. Some of the more intangible aspects of what it means to lose this terminal. So I think, we often hear people who I think overlook or kind of forget that coach buses are still a major component of our transportation system. And while they are still really, really critical often for lower income riders in particular, they're also really important sources of transportation for residents of more rural communities, especially communities that are poorly served by rail and certainly by airlines. There are also plenty of larger communities that are primarily connected to other cities by coach buses. Madison, Wisconsin, a city of almost 300,000 people, is basically only connected to other cities in the Midwest by coach buses. And that's a huge destination, especially for students, people traveling for business, taking advantage of academic institutions and such. But there's also a lot of other ways in which coach buses are really critical, in particular, the connection to Chicago or through Chicago. One thing we particularly want to highlight is the impact that this could have on people trying to access reproductive health resources. As I'm sure everybody is aware, after the Roe decision in 2020, Illinois became basically a sanctuary state for abortion services and other reproductive health services that are harder to get in our neighbors. As you can see from the two maps that we've shown, we're surrounded by a lot of states that have added a lot of restrictions, and there's been a massive increase in the number of people traveling to Illinois to get these services. And often these people are arriving on coach buses for multiple reasons. They're generally the lowest cost options. A lot of these people are coming from communities that are smaller, as I've mentioned, or rural, so they don't have other options aside from the bus. There are many people who are traveling long distances for the first time and are uncomfortable flying and therefore just prefer the bus as an option. But it also shouldn't be forgotten that many of the people who are coming to Chicago for these kind of services aren't necessarily coming from out of state or coming from states where there are restrictions on abortion services and other reproductive health services. They're simply coming to Chicago because it is the closest location where you can find enough of these services. And this goes beyond people looking for reproductive health services. Chicago is a destination for the LGBTQ community. Chicago is the destination for all sorts of healthcare services. Again, our city's size just means we can have a lot more of these amenities available. And very often people are taking the bus to get to these services. And then, of course, as we've mentioned, there's also the impact of people just traveling through the city as well. So the impacts of this loss go far beyond what we normally think about when we're thinking about, you know, transportation and, you know, the particular modes that people are taking. So this is a really, really critical moment that we're really glad to see a lot of people are, you know, raising alarm bells about. I do want to note, Better Street Chicago is currently hosting an additional email campaign. I know the high speed rail line started one quite a while ago. I am dropping the link to this in the chat so you can email your elected officials. We are just, again, at this point, we're trying to keep beating that drum to make sure that this issue doesn't get overlooked. But that was just a little note that I wanted to add on to the end here. But, you know, I think there's a lot of questions that people have about this. I have been monitoring the chat, but if everybody's comfortable, I think we can move into the Q&A portion of our webinar today. Does that sound good?
Absolutely.
Okay, great. Rick, do you want to kick it off?
Yeah, I have a couple. First, Joe, you know, I've taken Indian Trails, not recently, obviously, to Michigan on a number of occasions. And you've said that they've stopped serving the city. So this is much bigger than one carrier. This is multi.
Well, that's right. And just to give you a little framework, you know, some analysis we've done, we're predicting a full recovery to pre-pandemic for intercity bus travel probably next year. So the sector's doing just fine. It's probably tracking closer to like the Amtrak recovery than public transit. So Indian Trails, a longtime Michigan carrier, no longer is part of the Greyhound connecting pool. So they're on their own now with Trailways. And they came back to Chicago, but they just struggled with station arrangements and ended up stopping at the 95th Street CTA station, having passengers connect to come downtown. That, of course, is not going to be too attractive for lots of people. Megabus, when they came here for many years, they ran from a curb kind of at the south end of the old post office. So what we've had is kind of a hodgepodge situation, but the Greyhound terminal has sort of been the anchor, you know, for those carriers that are part of the Greyhound pool. And I think you look at other cities, particularly up and down the East Coast. Boston at South Station has a kind of a Union bus terminal there. Washington Union Station, they have a bus concourse anybody can use. The Port Authority in New York, Denver, Atlanta, others all have taken serious public efforts to create quality facilities. And I think, you know, what's different about Chicago is our role as that connecting hub. So we have potential for a lot more service here, like you mentioned with Indian Trails, if we have a quality environment.
So, you know, we talk about making it a lot easier for people to connect to things, right? And so right now we do have train service to Champaign, but it's not that good. And there's service missing at key times. Same thing with Springfield, our capital. We've got Amtrak service, but there's some really important key pieces missing. Ames, a lot of college people, a lot of kids from Chicago go to Ames or Iowa City. Galena has lost bus service for whatever reasons. We could, as a state, start to launch an intercity bus program that builds upon the Amtrak service. But Joe, do you think that's possible if there isn't a true station downtown?
Yeah, no, it's not. I'm glad you asked that, because a few months ago we came out with a policy brief kind of criticizing Illinois for being so slow to the game of using intercity bus as kind of a complement to rail. And it's remarkable, like there's no direct bus service from Chicago to Bloomington, which would be a perfect way to augment the Amtrak service. You know, the last train leaves early evening, you could have a late night bus departure. The two could work together. Chicago Champaign, you got like 8 hours in the middle of the day with no service. So we're looking at other states and they're doing that, like in the Cascade Corridor, they're augmenting bus and train. So you have convenient departures every few hours. Different states have created branded bus networks like Colorado's Bustang and Virginia Breeze and Virginia, where the rail and bus kind of a synergy, but all those places have dedicated stations. So you just can't, hard to imagine that working with a curbside situation. So we think IDOT should be a big part of that. Somewhat of a paradox. It was such a leader in some ways on rail, that bus has become a kind of forgotten mode in our state, and that station really, without a station, it's hard to imagine new services popping up if they have to dump off at a curb.
Yeah, personally, I'm very concerned about that because I've got a son going to college, and everywhere we looked at, it would be bus if he's going. So I want to make sure there's a good bus for college kids. So Gilda, we do have a bus station as a city. We don't own it yet. But it's very frustrating to me that this seems to be just, we're going to have a short-term solution while we figure out a long-term solution. Why can't the short-term solution be use the existing bus station? So what would need to change, or what would need to happen to have that bus station stay open?
We have not received any viable path to move forward with that suggestion. And so that's not anything that we can work on or work with. And I know that we keep speaking on long term, but the short term issue is that we need something like now, and we need to focus on that. We understand that we can't bring the same service that we're currently providing at the Greyhound station. We have worked, we're navigating, we are customizing the service to be able to be accommodated there at Union Station. So in answer to your question again, that's just not a path that we were able to take at the current location.
So you, but what would need to happen in order for that to happen? Is it, what is it, right? So there's got to be a path forward, but what is it?
Well, we need acceptable terms to stay, and so far we have not received those.
Okay. And then, so you've said that you're cutting service because of the moving out of the station. So what kind of cuts are going to happen?
Well, to be accommodated at Union Station, there was a time where we're not to be able to operate there. So that during the peak hours, they asked us not to operate. So we're not going to operate as many schedules or as much service as we do, but we'll have a foundation to operate to take care of our customers' needs. And that's the plan. We'll navigate it. We are accustomed to making a change to be able to accommodate our surroundings. And that is one of them that we have in place right now to operate there at Union Station.
And just so we're clear, at this point, the drop-off point that's being proposed is the red painted lane on Jackson, right?
Yes.
Okay.
And one other thing that we do have to keep in mind is that the service that we are providing now won't be able to go to Union Station. The need, we're still in talks, and we do have conversations are ongoing, and we hope that we can be able to work out a solution that's going to be best for the neighborhood, the community, and for our ridership.
Yeah, I appreciate you talking about this, because to me, unfortunately, I'm an old rail fan. And around the 60s, there were little small cuts that happened that had huge network impacts. And if there had been small interventions, perhaps the network wouldn't have collapsed as soon as it would, and we would have something more to work on. And for me, this feels like the same thing. So I am really curious if there's some way that we can help figure out what needs to happen in order to keep that bus station open. We'd really like to be involved in making that happen.
Well, here's an option. Maybe the city could buy the current location and operate it, and then that way it will be an intercity mode transportation location.
Okay.
So I think we got a good start to the Q&A. There's a lot of questions that are coming up in the chat and in the Q&A function. I want to start off with this one because Gilda, I think you kind of just answered the question But Clark Chernetsky asked if a public terminal is provided, would bus operators use it? And based on the answer that you just gave, it does sound like, yes, that is an attractive option for operators to operate out of a publicly owned terminal.
Right.
Is there any specific benefits for having a publicly owned terminal from the operator's perspective that is worth knowing, for people on the chat?
Well, it would be similar as the airport.
Mhm.
You have many airlines going in and outside of the airport, and it is owned by the city or publicly owned. And we were just looking for a model similar to that, where we can have more transit options coming in and out of the facility, and they would own and operate it.
Okay. Great. Thank you for answering that. We also have a lot of questions that are kind of falling in a similar theme that I think would be good to go after this one. And these will probably be better for Alderman Ramirez Rosa to answer. But they generally fall under the theme of what options does the city have to take leadership on this issue and acquire the terminal, whether that's directly purchasing. One person asked, is eminent domain an option? And another person was asking, specifically about the fact that the city has to, approve plans, whether that's a demolition plan, a development plan, a rezoning. Are there ways that the city can utilize these tools in order to acquire the terminal or arrive at an acceptable solution for everybody? So I'm going to give Alderman Ramirez Rosa first crack at that, if you would like, and then leave it to others.
Of course, yes. So the city for some time has looked at acquiring the Greyhound station, but the city does not currently have the funding in order to purchase the site for the amount that is being sought. And I believe it's about $25 million, but don't quote me on that since I have not been directly involved in these conversations. So obviously, if we could get federal or state funding, that would be a great boon towards acquiring the existing Greyhound station and adapting it to be an intercity bus terminal for various different intercity bus companies. But as we work towards acquiring the funding, I think the city also needs to think creatively about the regulatory power that it has. So the city has an ordinance that regulates where intercity bus companies can pick up and drop off. And so certainly that is a lever that the city can use to ensure that in the short term, we are not harming passengers who rely upon these services. But the city obviously also has zoning power. And it's not uncommon that when the city engages in zoning review, that we talk about what are the community benefits. And so I know there was a question around what needs to happen in the short term so that Greyhound could extend its lease, or rather Flix North America extend its lease at the current site. I think the city could use its powers to come in and say, hey, look, you all don't have someone to purchase this site right now. We think that you should work to extend that lease and tell the property owner that if they want to come back to the city and seek zoning relief in the future, that it will be well received by the city if they extend that lease in the short term. So I think we have to think creatively. Look, I think there's no question that the city desperately needs more housing, and areas in and around the loop have become very attractive for housing development. I see no reason why we could not have a mixed use development at this site in the long term, and that could bring down the cost for acquisition of this site. I did see a question too around eminent domain. I mean, eminent domain is a lengthy court process. And at the end of that process, you have to compensate the private property owner for what is determined to be the appropriate market cost. So perhaps maybe that is 25 million, maybe it's not. But at the end of the day, the city would need the funds necessary to be able to cover that cost. So my hope is that, now that the DNC is over, the city and its officials who were very, very busy dealing with all of the transportation issues related to the DNC, that now they can really look at this in a very meaningful way, particularly given that the clock is ticking with the lease at the current site. So whether that's the city stepping in and using its regulatory power and zoning powers to, help Flix North America extend its lease with the company that now owns the site, that may be an option. or whether it's figuring out how we can think creatively long term. Those would be some things that the city could do using its powers that it has.
Alderman, well, you were finishing this up. There was one other question that I wanted to ask that I think fits well to the answer that you gave. Somebody asked specifically, what is the role of the local alderman, in this case, Alderman Bill Conway, as opposed to other members of the city council? Do they have an outsized role in this decision? And how can they be positively influenced to take leadership on this as well?
Yeah, so, I don't want to speak for my colleague. His name is Alderman Bill Conway. I think that we obviously have a system of aldermanic prerogative or member deference, where when there's zoning and land use decisions that are being made, the council defers to one another. That said, it's a little bit different when it comes to large, major, citywide developments like this one. And so it's not uncommon, particularly in and around the central business district, to see the mayor's office play a bigger role and to see different aldermen weigh in on these major important issues as well. So I don't know where Alderman Bill Conway stands on this specific issue. I certainly hope that he supports an intercity bus terminal at the existing site. I think that, as you look at the various different options downtown, this is a very attractive option, particularly if you're able to open up that tunnel between the Clinton Blue Line stop and the Amtrak's Union Station. So I think it's a very well situated site. Again, it also allows a lot of space for pickup and drop off, whether that be from rideshare companies or from loved ones picking up, their loved one at that site. So I think the existing site is a very good option. And I know many of the experts that have looked at it as well say this is a great option that should be maintained in the long term.
Thank you. So I do want to add to, I've seen in the chat a number of people talking about the distance from Union Station. I think one thing that often comes up in the conversation about Chicago's Greyhound terminal is, the fact that it's not located directly next to a CTA stop or a metro stop. It is worth noting that it is within, it's less than a half mile from, it's about 0.15 miles, so 0.15 from the CTA Clinton Blue Line stop, and it's about 0.3 miles from Union Station, and then it's only about 0.6 miles from LaSalle Street Station. So although it's not ideal in the sense that you can walk across the street and be at the terminal, it is relatively centrally located, although that does raise, that still is a challenge for people carrying bags and stuff. But as Alderman Rosa mentioned, part of the opportunity here is to also think about how can we integrate this entire kind of West Loop terminal area better for all users. And I do see there are many people who are still noting that it is an issue, but it's one of those things that we need to figure out when we lack other sites. I also want to note several people in the chat have also asked who the current property owner is. The current property owners, it's 20 Lakes Holding, they're a private equity firm. And then also note that Lena Reynolds from ELPC provided some additional context in the chat, if you haven't seen it, about why they're not looking to extend their lease. At this point, it does appear that the current property owner is looking to have the site redeveloped, and that is likely one of the reasons why they're not extending the lease. And on that note, I did have at least one person ask, and this is specifically directed for Gilda, is FlixBus, in the event that a lease could be extended or the current terminal could be purchased by the city or an operator who is willing to work with these, is FlixBus open to continue using the existing terminal?
Well, Flix Greyhound, yes, we are open to conversation. We're open to ideas and anything that may help us be able to continue the service that we have. I also want to mention, though, it's just not Greyhound and Flix that's operating out of that facility. It's Burlington Trailways and it's Barron's, and those are carriers that are within the state and such. So we're not the only ones that are in jeopardy right now of not being able to have a viable service for the community.
Thank you. Just going through the chat a little bit, trying to catch up on some of the questions. It is great to see everybody has a lot of thoughts about this and there's a lot of questions about it. So we had one question from Akshara Das. And this one is maybe good to direct towards Joe, but what can urban planning students and other young emerging professionals do to help identify solutions to this issue or help push the city in the right direction about finding a solution?
Yeah, well, that question brings to mind when Philadelphia had a sort of a smaller problem like this. What they found was that in Philadelphia, there was no advocacy organization that could speak for bus travelers. And it's quite different than, I mean, Rick, of course, speaks for the high-speed rail community, the rail community in a really effective way. And there's transit groups like here's Michael's. But in a lot of cities, nobody speaks for this huge population that uses the intercity bus. They may only use it once or twice a year in an emergency. And so I think that's really important to push policymakers to see that there's kind of this silent traveling community out there that doesn't get the attention it deserves. So I think that's a critical thing. And then not to fall back on, well, it's a private business. Why are we subsidizing a private business? That's really I think a red herring to view that, because these services really are like public utilities. I mean, it's the only way to get to a lot of towns around the Midwest is to take the bus. And a lot of cities have woken up to that. But I think here in the Midwest, it's a little slower for policymakers to see bus travel as really part of the governmental responsibility to cultivate. So great question, Scar.
Another question that we got from Rebecca Perlman. Could a new intercity bus terminal serve passengers beyond the operators that are currently using the Greyhound terminal? So is this an opportunity basically to create a larger union bus terminal where all operators in the city could consolidate? And I think this is something I can leave to Joe or Gilda.
Yeah.
Or
well, I'll take a whack at that and love Gilda's comments too. But what we've been calling for the city to do is just due diligence. I mean, one of the East Coast cities had an issue. They're surveying other towns. How much do you charge for bus departures for people using your union bus terminal? What's the going rate? Is it, $50 a bus? Is it per passenger? Is the same rate every day, rush hour? And to really learn, if you were to run this as a public facility, what share of the cost could be borne by user fees. Could the TIF project in the area pay for part of it? And so it's a really important piece of analysis that hasn't been happened. And I think when you do that, you'll see that bus lines can pay a significant share of the cost, or at least the cost that's not including the development, redevelopment premium that's on that site now, because the developer may think that owner may think they can rezone for a massive residential property. And then the last thing I'll say about that, maybe Gilda can comment, and some cities have mandated or made it very difficult for bus lines to operate from curbs because they want you in that central bus station. And Boston and Washington are good examples of that. So if you were to create this station, you could, find ways to coax bus lines to use it to create this cohesion or this hub that can be so important. Gilda, you're welcome to chime in there too.
Well, I think it's an opportunity for growth in that area and more potential. When I was speaking of earlier, the nostalgia part of it is that Greyhound transit has always been the fabric of the country. And we are just now beginning to navigate our way into pricing, being competitive, and offering solutions instead of just fixed rates and such. So yeah, we need to pivot and relook at the way we operate now as a city, as a company, as a whole, because there's opportunity there and it's there for the growth. You can get in some cities, you go in and you have so many different options. And when you have options, then of course it's competitive. And who benefits from that is the public. And so, yes, I think it is.
We've gotten a number of questions about, options similar to Ogilvy Transportation Center, having these, Alderman Ramirez Rosa mentioned potentially doing a multi-use development with the terminals part of it. Joe, you have a lot of knowledge of different terminal facilities in the United States and around the world. Can you think of any examples of bus terminals that are integrated into multimodal facilities that you could maybe share some information on?
Yeah, and it's
Multi-use, I should say multi-use is what I was getting at. I think I said multimodal.
right. It is interesting how with some creative thought, I mean, you can do things really quickly. And Union Station, Washington is the best example where they took a floor of a parking deck. And nobody's going to give the bus station any beauty awards because you're literally in a parking deck. But the bus lines have put little shelters up that are air conditioned with ticket booths, and it works just fine. And you're really 90 seconds away from the trains, which I know something Rick would like, but it works well. In Boston South Station, they're adding a office tower, a residential tower over the tracks. And with that, they're going to expand the bus station by 50%, kind of a perk of building that facility. So I am convinced that, with a little lead time and a consultant to help, if we find out we can't save the station, there would be some off-street options. And again, nothing's as good as saving the station, but other cities, less compelling, have created modular facilities and parking lots. And that would be for a transportation hub like Chicago, that would be a pretty sad outcome. But it certainly would be better than just a curb with no place to wait at all. So out east, a lot of really good examples.
Great, thank you. And then I had another question. Somebody asked if we have any details about who is, basically what's the demographic profile of riders using Flix, Greyhound, and the other services using the Greyhound terminal. Do you have any information about that to kind of, give a little bit more detail about who these riders are, where they're coming from, so we can better understand that profile?
Is that for me?
Yeah, go ahead, Gilda.
That was for whoever has that information, if they have it available.
I was going to say basically that 71% of our ridership in Chicago make less than $35,000 a year. And so it's a varied base of clientele there. We have people that cannot afford a viable transportation from city to city. We have students, we have senior citizens, and then don't forget, we also have those people that just don't want to fly. And so it's a varied base out of Chicago, big city. Now, someone else may have more information, but.
Yeah, and I'll augment that. The state governments around the Midwest have done surveys of bus drivers. It tells that same thing. You have a slight overrepresentation of minority groups, slightly more females than males based on population because a lot of car light households critical. But in addition to that, just want to emphasize that companies like FlixBus and Burlington Trailways have a really broad demographic too. I mean, they're bringing people to Chicago for leisure weekends. While it's not as proportionally as high as the airlines for that, it's a mainstream travel option in a lot of cities. So downtown Chicago and Rick, you've said this, really need to make it easier to get people downtown post-pandemic. So and very sustainable, where buses get about 200 passenger miles per gallon, which is really something you would think would make this a priority right now.
So the questions have really slowed down, but there was one more that popped up that I just want to ask really quick. A few people have asked questions that touched on whether suburban sites are an option. Somebody has mentioned the Joliet Transportation Center. At least another person mentioned the O'Hare Transportation Center. Are these viable options for either a temporary or permanent solution? And what are the pros and cons of having a site in the suburb versus the city center? And I think that can probably go to Gilda, Joe, Rick, any of you could potentially answer this.
Rick, go ahead if you like.
Oh, I don't have an answer. I know that I was told by Gary that they were thinking of building a transfer center to replace Chicago. Joliet seems like an interesting place. I get frustrated by those discussions because we should be bringing people to Chicago. But I don't have an answer beyond that.
We're always pro Chicago boosterism.
I mean, Columbus is doing something like that, where an old gas station became the Greyhound Barron station, and the neighborhood got upset. And that's something I'm telling reporters and everybody, when you move bus lines this big, 80 buses a day, you're going to have a lot of neighborhood pushback no matter where you go. So in Columbus, they hatched an agreement where the buses leave from the curb downtown, but the connections are made at this former gas station, which works, but Chicago is just so big and geographically complicated. You can't imagine a bus from the east, dropping off Chicago and then driving out to Joliet to reach the transfer center. It just boggles the mind. So Gilder, the alderman, certainly could weigh in on that too. It's really a vexing question.
Well, we want to make sure that whatever, if it doesn't work for us to be at the parent transportation where we're suggesting, we like different ideas, but we do want to make sure that it's convenient and easily accessible for our customers. And we also have to keep in mind that the season is changing. And being in Chicago could be brutal during the weather with the weather and such, snow, wind, rain. And so being an off-site transfer location is something that we could review and look at closer, but we'd have to make sure that it's in close proximity to where we will be servicing.
Well, great, thank you. So as I mentioned, the questions have mostly slowed down. I do want to note in the chat, there's been a very robust conversation about, options for both suburban, airport, and city center sites. It does seem that the consensus is more connectivity as opposed to having it just be an either or, which is exciting to hear because I think this is a group of people that is always pro more multimodal connections. So hopefully what this conversation ultimately results in is not only identifying an appropriate permanent site for a downtown bus terminal, but also options to better integrate, stops at the edge of the city and other terminal options, and having a really robust network. We are about a minute from time, so I do want to thank everybody for joining today. And I should note, I have dropped in the chat again, and I'm going to do so right now, the link to the Better Street Chicago email campaign. So please take the moment to reach out to your elected officials and let them know that there's an important issue for you. And I just want to open the floor in the last minute to any of our panelists if they want to make any final comments.
I'd like to say again, thank you for putting this on the platform. Our urgency is dire, or we need to come to a solution and we need to make it soon. I appreciate the feedback from the other panelists and from the aldermen. And we do know that the conversations are still continuing, but we're going to have a resolution soon.
Excellent. Thank you, Alderman. Thank you, Gilda, for joining us, Joe and Mike. Really appreciate it. I want to, as a closing note, I rewatched the movie Hair recently, and there's the beginning opening scene is very moving, where the country boy gets on a bus to go to the big city. And it shows the very important connections that happen when people have transportation options. So thanks again, everybody, for being here. And hopefully we can come up with a good resolution to this problem. And thanks, Mike, for putting it all together. So good day.
Thank you, everyone.
Take care.